There is a sentence Ruth said to me that I have not been able to shake for 3 weeks. She said, "In 62 years, I never once won an argument with my husband." And she said it like it was the secret. Like that was the whole answer. Ruth and Gerald have been married since 1963. They met at a church potluck in rural Ohio when she was 19 and he was 22, and if you saw them together today, Gerald still holding the car door, Ruth still laughing at jokes she's heard 500 times, you would want whatever they have. You would feel it immediately. There is a steadiness between them that most of us have stopped believing is real. 62 years. 3 kids. 1 miscarriage they barely spoke about until their 50s. A business that nearly bankrupted them in 1987. They are not a fantasy. They are evidence. And I mean it when I say I love them. But I need you to understand something about the world Ruth and Gerald got married into before we let their advice land unchecked. 1963 was 3 years before the National Organization for Women was founded. It was the same year Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, a book that tried to name the quiet devastation of women whose entire identity had been legally and socially funneled into wifehood. When Ruth says she never won an argument, she is not only describing a communication strategy. She is describing a world where a woman's financial survival, social standing, and sense of self were architecturally dependent on keeping the marriage intact, at nearly any cost. Divorce carried a stigma that functioned closer to exile. There was no couples therapy on the corner. There was endurance, and there was failure, and there was very little in between. That context doesn't erase what Ruth and Gerald built. It makes it more complicated and more interesting. Here's what we are going to do together in this video. We are going to take 5 pieces of real wisdom from Ruth and Gerald, wisdom earned across 6 decades of a real marriage with real fractures, and we are going to run each one through 2 filters. What does this tell us that is genuinely true and timeless? And what does this assume about your life that may not be true at all? We will bring in the research, Gottman's conflict studies, Sue Johnson's work on emotional responsiveness, the actual psychology of what happens in a human brain during an argument, not to debunk Ruth and Gerald, but to sharpen what they're handing us. To make it usable for a couple in 2026 navigating dual careers, therapy language, Instagram comparisons, and the particular loneliness of being modern and in love. By the end of this video, you will have 5 updated relationship principles, each one rooted in 62 years of lived experience and tested against contemporary psychology. Not here's the lesson. Here's the evolved lesson. The one Ruth and Gerald were reaching toward without the vocabulary to name it. The first thing Gerald said when I asked him about conflict was something so simple it almost made me dismiss it entirely, until I realized I had been doing the opposite my whole life. Gerald leaned back in his chair and said it like it was obvious, the second you start trying to win, you've already lost her. He wasn't talking about surrendering. He wasn't describing a man who rolls over and agrees to keep the peace. He was describing something more specific, a moment he said he learned the hard way, somewhere around year 7 of their marriage, when he realized he could be completely correct about a fact and still walk away from the conversation having done damage he couldn't immediately see. He said, "I used to think being right was the same thing as being a good husband. It took me a long time to figure out those are 2 completely different jobs." That sentence was formed in a household where Gerald was the sole earner, where his sense of competence and authority was tied directly to being the one who knew things, decided things, solved things. The 1960s and 70s rewarded men for certainty. Emotional vulnerability wasn't a value system available to most men of Gerald's generation. It was, in many social contexts, a liability. So when Gerald talks about learning to let go of winning, he is describing an enormous private revolution that his era gave him almost no roadmap for. He figured it out anyway. That matters. But it's worth naming that the stakes for Ruth of Gerald not figuring it out were considerably higher than the reverse. Here's what the research says about what Gerald was actually describing. John Gottman, after studying thousands of couples at his lab in Seattle over 4 decades, identified what he calls contempt as the single greatest predictor of relationship dissolution, more than anger, more than conflict frequency, more than incompatibility of values. Contempt is what happens when a desire to be right metastasizes into a desire to be superior. It's the eye roll. The dismissive sigh. The way you reframe an argument so that winning it requires your partner to be not just wrong, but foolish for having thought otherwise. Gottman found that couples who fight, genuinely, heatedly fight, but do so without contempt have significantly stronger relationships than couples who avoid conflict altogether. The goal was never to stop arguing. The goal was to stop arguing at each other and start arguing toward each other. The updated principle is this: being right is a solo achievement. Being close is a collaborative one. You cannot pursue both at the same time. The second thing Ruth said stopped me because she said it without any awareness of how radical it was. She said, "I decided early on that I would rather understand Gerald than change him." She described a specific moment, their second year of marriage, a fight about money that she now can't fully remember the details of, where she said she made a quiet internal choice to get curious about why he thought the way he did instead of simply trying to override it. She said understanding him became, over time, more interesting than correcting him. She said it almost like a hobby she had stumbled into. What Ruth did not have access to in 1965 was the language of what she was actually practicing. Decades later, psychologist Carl Rogers would formalize something he called unconditional positive regard, the therapeutic stance of accepting another person's inner world as real and valid without requiring it to match your own. Sue Johnson, who developed emotionally focused therapy in the 1980s, built an entire couples intervention model around a similar idea, that most relationship conflict is not actually about the surface issue, the money, the dishes, the in-laws, but about the underlying attachment question each partner is asking. Are you there for me? Do I matter to you? Will you choose me? Ruth, without a therapist in sight, had intuited that the content of the argument was almost never the point. The emotional need underneath it was. Here's where the context layer matters, though. Ruth's decision to understand Gerald rather than change him was a survival strategy as much as a love strategy. Women in that era who pushed too hard for a partner to change ran real risks, social, financial, relational. Choosing curiosity over confrontation was also, for many women of Ruth's generation, the path of least resistance available to them. We can honor the wisdom of the choice while acknowledging that it wasn't made in conditions of full equality. The updated principle is this: curiosity about your partner is not the same as acceptance of harm. You can choose to understand someone deeply and hold a clear boundary about what you will not absorb. Ruth got the first part exactly right. Modern couples need both. Gerald said it with complete confidence, the way men of his generation often deliver the things they are most certain about: never go to bed angry. You settle it before the lights go out, no matter how long it takes. You don't carry it into tomorrow. He told a story about a specific night, 1978, he thinks, their 15th year. where he and Ruth sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning working through something he described only as the real bad one. He said they were both exhausted and neither of them was at their best, but they stayed at that table because that was the rule. He said, "We didn't always fix it, but we always finished it." There is something genuinely moving about that image. Two people at a kitchen table at 2 a.m., choosing each other over sleep, over pride, over the easier exit of just going silent. The commitment underneath that practice is real and worth keeping. But here is what Gerald was working with that modern neuroscience has since complicated considerably. He was working from an era when anger was frequently the only emotion men were socially permitted to name. What looked like settling the argument at that kitchen table may have often been Ruth absorbing Gerald's unresolved frustration until he felt finished, not because the issue was resolved, but because she had de-escalated enough that he could sleep. More importantly, when a human nervous system is flooded, when your heart rate exceeds roughly 100 beats per minute during conflict, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for empathy, perspective-taking, and rational problem-solving, goes significantly offline. Gottman's research specifically addresses this, calling it physiological flooding, and his data suggests that continuing to argue while flooded does not resolve conflict. It encodes it more deeply into the body as threat. What Gerald was describing as virtue, pushing through exhaustion to finish the fight, is sometimes exactly the right call. And sometimes it is two people doing damage to each other with diminishing returns at 2 a.m. that a night of sleep and a regulated nervous system would have resolved in 20 minutes the next morning. The updated principle is this: the real rule isn't never go to bed angry. It's never go to bed without an agreement to return. A pause is not abandonment. A pause, named and scheduled, is one of the most sophisticated conflict tools available to a modern couple. And here is the place where I want to name something directly, because this is the kind of observation that competitor channels skip because it requires a little intellectual courage. When Gerald says, "We always finished it," he is describing a dynamic where he determined when the conversation was finished. Ruth's version of that same story, had I asked her first, separately, without Gerald in the room, might have had a different texture. The wisdom of staying engaged is real. Who gets to decide when engagement is complete is a question Gerald and Ruth's era simply did not ask. Yours should. The fourth piece of wisdom came from Ruth, and it arrived quietly, almost as a footnote to something else she was saying. She said, "We never kept score. What I did for us. What he did for us. We didn't count." She described a household where she handled certain things and Gerald handled others, and neither of them, she said, walked around with a mental ledger of contributions. She seemed almost puzzled by the idea that a couple would operate any other way. I want to be careful here, because the principle Ruth is pointing toward is one of the most well-supported ideas in relationship psychology. Gottman's research on what he calls the quid pro quo trap, where partners transactionally exchange effort and keep running accounts of who owes whom, consistently shows that couples who operate this way report lower satisfaction and higher resentment over time. The antidote, his research suggests, is a culture of generosity, doing for your partner not because you calculated that it's your turn, but because you genuinely want the relationship to flourish. Ruth intuited this completely. But I need to name something Ruth did not name, because she couldn't quite see it from inside it. Ruth and Gerald's household ran on a division of labor that was not actually equal, it was separate. Ruth managed the interior of their life, the children, the meals, the emotional temperature of the family, the invisible architecture that holds a household together. Gerald managed the exterior, the income, the car, the decisions that got made in public. Neither of them counted contributions because the contributions were sorted by gender before they were ever chosen. Telling modern couples not to keep score without acknowledging that the categories of contribution in many relationships still fall along gendered lines, and that those lines are rarely drawn with mutual intention, is advice that can quietly ask one partner to be generous about an imbalance neither of them has examined. It's also worth naming plainly, Ruth and Gerald built this marriage on a single income that supported an entire family in an era when housing, childcare, and healthcare costs allowed for that reality. Fewer than a quarter of American households can structurally access that model today. Their advice on financial unity is wise and worth carrying forward. The math was different. The updated principle is this: stop counting contributions, but first, have the conversation about whether the contributions themselves are being chosen freely. Generosity built on an unexamined foundation is not generosity. It's accommodation with a prettier name. The fifth thing Gerald said, he said quietly. Not with the confidence of the other four. He said it looking at his hands, actually, which is how I knew it was the real one. He said, there was a period, I think we were in our late 40s, where I looked up and realized I had been living next to Ruth without actually seeing her. I had gotten so good at being her husband that I had stopped being curious about who she was becoming. He paused for a long time. Then he said, she had changed. And I had been too busy maintaining the marriage to notice the person inside it. Ruth, sitting beside him, didn't correct him. She just nodded slowly, looking at the middle distance. Which told me everything about how true it was, and how long it had taken both of them to be able to say it out loud. What Gerald was describing has a name in contemporary psychology. Psychologist Dan McAdams has spent decades studying what he calls narrative identity, the ongoing story we construct about who we are, where we've been, and where we're headed. His research suggests that human identity is not static, it is a living document, continuously revised by experience, loss, growth, and choice. When couples stop updating their understanding of each other's narrative, when they relate to the archived version of their partner rather than the current one, they don't just grow apart. They begin to share a home with a stranger they are confident they know. The gap between who your partner is and who you believe them to be becomes, over time, a form of loneliness that is almost harder to name than ordinary loneliness because it wears the costume of closeness. Gerald caught it. In their late 40s, something cracked open enough for him to notice the distance he had helped create. They found their way back. Ruth described a period of what she called relearning each other that she said was, unexpectedly, one of the most intimate chapters of their marriage. But they did it without a therapist, without language for attachment, without any of the tools that exist now specifically for this moment in a long partnership. The updated principle is this: the person you married is not a fixed destination. They are a moving one. Loving someone for 60 years means being willing to meet them for the first time, again and again, for 60 years. Here's what strikes me, looking at all 5 of these together. Ruth and Gerald have handed us 5 pieces of wisdom about conflict, curiosity, engagement, generosity, and presence. And every single one of them, underneath the specific advice, is pointing at the same thing. They are all instructions for how to keep choosing proximity over pride. Every one. Don't try to win, stay close. Get curious instead of corrective, stay close. Don't abandon the conversation, stay close. Stop tallying, stay close. Keep seeing who they're becoming, stay close. The entire architecture of their 62-year marriage, distilled, is a single repeated decision: closeness over ego, closeness over comfort, closeness over the easier thing. I want to give that pattern a name because I think it deserves one. I am going to call it the proximity practice. Not a feeling. Not a romantic orientation. A practice, meaning it is a thing you do, repeatedly, imperfectly, on days when you feel like it and on days when you emphatically do not. Ruth and Gerald did not stay together for 62 years because they were more compatible than you, or because they loved each other more intensely than you are capable of loving someone. They stayed together because they built, largely without conscious awareness of what they were building, a daily practice of returning to each other. Of choosing the shorter distance. What makes this hard to simply import into 2026 is that the proximity practice Ruth and Gerald built was, in part, structurally enforced. Divorce was costly, financially, socially, spiritually, for Ruth especially. Some of their returning to each other was chosen. Some of it was the absence of an affordable alternative. Modern couples have more exits available. This is, in most ways, a profound good. No one should be trapped. But the availability of the exit changes the psychological texture of the choice to stay. When leaving is genuinely possible, choosing to return to your partner becomes a different kind of act. It becomes fully volitional in a way Ruth and Gerald's version simply wasn't. Which means modern couples are actually being asked to do something harder than what Ruth and Gerald did. You are being asked to practice proximity without the walls that once made it the default. You are being asked to choose closeness in an environment specifically engineered to offer you distance, your phone, your autonomy, your awareness that you have options, the constant low hum of comparison that did not exist in a 1963 Ohio living room. The modern couple's challenge is not a lack of love. It is a surplus of alternatives to the harder, slower, more demanding work of staying genuinely close to one specific person across time. Social media hands you a daily referendum on whether your relationship is enough. Economic instability makes the practical foundations of partnership feel perpetually uncertain. The mainstreaming of therapy has given couples language for their dysfunction without always giving them equal amounts of tolerance for the ordinary friction that healthy relationships also contain. And the dissolving of rigid gender roles, which is unambiguously a gain, has left many couples without inherited scripts for how to divide a life, which means every decision about labor, money, ambition, and sacrifice has to be consciously negotiated rather than simply inherited. That is more freedom and more work, simultaneously. Ruth and Gerald did not navigate any of that. They navigated different, and in some ways harder, things. But not that. I keep thinking about Ruth and Gerald at that kitchen table in 1978. 2 a.m. Something between them that was real and serious and unresolved. Neither of them leaving. What they built over 62 years is not a blueprint. I want to be careful about that word, because blueprints imply that you can follow the same steps and arrive at the same structure, and Ruth and Gerald's world and yours are not the same world. The economics are different. The gender dynamics are different. The psychological vocabulary available to you is richer and more honest than anything their era offered. But here is what I think it costs us to pretend their world and ours are entirely separate. We lose the evidence. We lose the proof that it is actually possible for two people to remain genuinely curious about each other across decades. To keep fighting toward each other instead of at each other. To look up in their late 40s, notice the distance, and choose, without a script, without a therapist, without any guarantee, to close it. And here is what it costs us to take their wisdom wholesale, without the context layer, without the pushback. We hand the next generation advice calibrated for a world that no longer exists. dressed up as timeless truth. We asked people, often women, disproportionately, to practice generosity inside structures they never examined. We romanticize endurance without distinguishing it from growth. Ruth and Gerald deserve better than to be made into a meme. And so do you. If you are watching this and something in Gerald's fifth piece of wisdom landed somewhere specific in your chest, the part about living next to someone without truly seeing them, sit with that. Not with shame. With the particular curiosity that Gerald himself eventually found. Because the fact that you can recognize that distance means you have not yet stopped caring about closing it. That matters more than you might think. And if you recognized yourself in the scoring, the mental ledger, the unspoken tallies, the exhausted arithmetic of who did what and when, ask yourself honestly whether the problem is the counting, or whether the counting is a symptom of a conversation about fairness that hasn't happened yet. Sometimes the spreadsheet is the relationship trying to tell you something in the only language currently available to it. Here's where we land. 5 pieces of wisdom from Ruth and Gerald, carried forward in updated form, not discarded, not swallowed whole, but translated. Stop trying to win the argument, and start asking what the argument is actually about, because it is almost never what it appears to be. Choose to understand your partner before you try to redirect them, but know that understanding is not the same as absorbing. You are allowed to do both. When the conversation floods, name the pause and schedule the return, because a break with an intention is not retreat, it is strategy. Stop counting contributions, but first examine whether the contributions themselves are being chosen freely and equally. And keep asking who your partner is becoming, because the most profound act of long-term love is the willingness to be genuinely surprised by the person you think you already know completely. If one of these 5 points landed harder than the others, I would genuinely love to know which one, and more than that, I would love to know why. Leave it in the comments. And if your own grandparents, or an elder couple in your life, handed you a piece of relationship wisdom that you have been carrying around half believing, share it. This channel is built on exactly that material, the wisdom that deserves to be honored and examined, held up to the light and turned slowly until we can see what is gold and what is simply the residue of a different time. If that kind of translation is useful to you, there is a subscribe button somewhere on this page. That is all I will say about that. Here is the only thing I know for certain after spending time with Ruth and Gerald, after reading the research, after sitting with all 5 of these points until they became something larger than the sum of their parts. The couples who last are not the ones who found the right person and held on. They are the ones who kept choosing to look, really look, at the person already beside them, and found, somehow, that there was always still more there to see.